In the Himalayas, even breathing can be a challenge. And yet, life goes on. At these altitudes, where the air is so thin that every movement demands more than usual, survival isn't just about strength or speed, but something far more fundamental: keeping the body functioning when everything around it works against you. Temperatures can drop within minutes, the terrain shifts without warning, and the wind cuts through any protection, turning every step into a real risk. And still, what seems empty at first glance reveals an active system, where species don't just endure these conditions, they depend on them, proving that here, the limit doesn't stop life, it defines how it exists. There's a common idea that mountains are simply natural barriers, massive formations that divide territories and shape the climate. But in the Himalayas, that idea quickly falls apart, because these mountains don't just separate the world, they create their own system, with rules that don't apply anywhere else. As altitude increases, everything changes gradually. Vegetation disappears. The ground becomes uneven and unstable, and the air loses density, drastically reducing oxygen levels, making even the simplest tasks require constant effort. For many species, this would be an absolute limit, but here, it's only the starting point for a different kind of adaptation. The animals that live at these heights don't just survive, they are shaped by these conditions, adjusting every movement, every energy cost, and every decision to an environment where nothing is wasted. And even when the landscape seems empty, there is constant activity unfolding. Predators watching from a distance, prey moving in tight groups, and small organisms quietly sustaining the balance of the ecosystem, a balance that depends directly on cold, altitude, and time. And it is precisely this balance that slowly begins to be tested. If you're interested in how life survives in the most extreme environments on Earth, consider subscribing to the channel, because there is much more to discover. From a distance, the slopes of the Himalayas appear empty, dominated by exposed rock and uneven snow, with barely any signs of movement. But that impression doesn't last for long for those who observe closely, because little by little, the silence begins to reveal patterns, and what once seemed still begins to move. At altitudes where almost nothing grows, small groups of bharal, also known as blue sheep, move across extreme slopes with a precision that defies logic, placing each step on surfaces that would be impossible for most animals to cross. And more than simply moving, they choose exactly where to be. They remain in elevated areas with a wide view of their surroundings, not by chance, but because here, detecting danger first may be the only way to stay alive, and there is a reason for that constant vigilance, even when nothing seems to be happening. Somewhere in the landscape, perfectly blended into rock and snow, is the primary predator of these mountains, the snow leopard, an animal that is rarely seen and does not rely on long chases, but on silent approaches that begin long before any visible movement. It watches, waits, and above all, chooses the exact moment when the environment starts to work in its favor. And that is where the risk begins, because survival here depends not only on speed or strength, but on the ability to interpret almost imperceptible signals, with the bharal constantly adjusting their position, avoiding exposed areas, and reacting to changes that are not always obvious. And while this tension unfolds on the higher slopes, another form of survival takes place quietly among the rocks. There, almost invisible, the pika moves quickly, collecting fragments of vegetation and storing them in protected shelters, building reserves that will become essential when the environment stops offering any resources. Unlike larger herbivores, it does not react to winter when it arrives, it prepares in advance, turning time itself into survival. Each species solves the same problem in a different way, some through movement, others through energy conservation, others by anticipating what is coming. And it is this diversity of strategies that keeps the system functioning, even in an environment where everything seems limited. Above them all, the Himalayan vulture glides through the sky, riding rising air currents along the slopes, covering vast distances with minimal effort, scanning for any sign of opportunity, playing a crucial role in ensuring that nothing goes to waste. And as these interactions begin to connect, what forms is no longer an empty landscape, but something far more complex, an active system operating at the edge, where every movement carries consequences. But this balance does not remain unchanged for long, because slowly, something begins to shift. As the days pass, the Himalayas begin to change, and this shift does not go unnoticed. What was once just cold turns into constant pressure, as snow starts to cover feeding grounds, and every movement demands more energy than the body can recover. Gradually, the environment stops offering options. For the Barl, every decision begins to carry consequences. Staying in higher ground ensures visibility, but limits access to food. Moving lower increases the chances of feeding, but also raises the level of risk. At this point, there is no safe choice, only decisions that delay what cannot be avoided. And it is precisely this concentration of movement that begins to influence the one that watches. The snow leopard does not rush, does not expose itself, but it senses the shift. As prey begin to move through more predictable paths, the need to cover large distances decreases, and opportunities start to appear more often. Its body is already adapted to this environment, wide paws distributing weight across the snow, a long tail maintaining balance on unstable terrain, and a coat that renders it nearly invisible. But even with all these advantages, nothing here is guaranteed, because in the Himalayas, a failed attempt is not just a mistake, it is lost energy, and energy is not easily regained. While this tension builds across the slopes, another reality unfolds in silence. The pika no longer gathers food. Now it depends entirely on what it managed to store before, reducing movement to a minimum, and turning survival into a matter of precision. Every unnecessary movement costs more than it can afford. Above this landscape, the Himalayan vulture continues to move, but its pattern begins to shift. Finding food now requires more time, greater distance, and increased effort, reflecting an environment that is slowing down without ever fully stopping. And it is within this slower rhythm that the Himalayas begin to reveal one of their harshest rules. Here, survival is not only about adaptation, it is about timing. Knowing when to move, when to conserve, and above all, when not to fail. Because as snow deepens and the cold intensifies, this process stops being gradual and begins to turn decisive. As winter advances, the Himalayas stop being just a difficult environment and begin to function as a constant filter, where every element of the landscape imposes stricter and less predictable limits. As snow covers familiar routes, erases old paths, and turns once stable ground into unstable surfaces, forcing what used to be routine to demand constant attention. Groups of Baro continue moving along the slopes, but no longer with the same freedom, as the consistency of the ground shifts with every step, alternating between firm support and surfaces that give way under pressure, creating a risk that comes not only from predators, but from the terrain itself. Remaining still is not an option, as food disappears beneath the snow, but moving also comes at a cost. And it is within this unstable balance that the environment slowly begins to favor the one that watches without being seen. Snow leopard does not need to change its strategy. It simply follows these variations, keeping its distance, analyzing patterns, and waiting for the moment when small differences begin to appear within the group. Differences that may seem insignificant at first, but in this environment carry disproportionate consequences. On a narrow slope, the group moves in coordination, testing each foothold before committing weight, maintaining a steady rhythm that depends on the precision of every individual. But as the need to find food intensifies, subtle variations begin to emerge, and one of them shifts slightly out of formation. Searching for an area where the snow appears thinner, a minimal adjustment, almost invisible. At a distance, yet enough to change everything. From above, blended into rock and ice, the snow leopard is already in position, using the slope to its advantage and minimizing any chance of detection. And when the moment forms, the action unfolds quickly and directly, leaving no space for an organized response, because on this terrain, escape depends as much on stability as it does on speed, and when stability fails, the outcome stops being a struggle and becomes a consequence. In a matter of seconds, it is over. Silence returns, and what remains is not only the result of a hunt, but the confirmation of a rule that defines these mountains, where mistakes do not need to be frequent to be decisive. Because in the Himalayas, when they happen, they rarely offer a second chance. Here, mistakes don't repeat, they end. With winter now fully established, the Himalayas enter a phase where simply enduring is no longer the greatest challenge. Because the problem is no longer limited to the external environment, it begins to emerge from within the body itself. As snow covers nearly all available vegetation and whatever remains requires longer, more frequent, and increasingly risky movements to reach. For the Barl, every step now carries more weight than before. As staying in higher ground reduces immediate exposure but accelerates physical exhaustion, while descending in search of food may improve short-term survival, yet significantly increases the risk of dangerous encounters. and the strain becomes evident at a point where no decision fully solves the problem. Each one only delays its in sequences. This wear does not appear suddenly, it builds in silence, first through almost imperceptible signs, a slightly slower pace, pauses that last a bit longer, reactions delayed by fractions of a second, until the group, once tightly coordinated, begins to show internal variation that did not exist before, and it is in these differences that the balance begins to shift. The snow leopard does not need to change its behavior, it simply finds an environment where opportunities are no longer rare. They begin to emerge naturally. Because vulnerability no longer needs to be created, it becomes part of the system itself. Meanwhile, on another scale, the Himalayan fox remains active beneath the snow, using its hearing to detect almost imperceptible movement and adjusting each leap with precision. Even in an environment that constantly distorts sound, forcing repeated attempts before reaching an accurate result, nothing here is simple, but some strategies remain more efficient than others. And it is that difference that begins to define which individuals can remain active for longer. The wind reshapes the surface again and again. The cold maintains constant pressure, and the environment continues to remove any excess without warning, gradually forcing the system into a narrower, more demanding balance with less tolerance for error. And as this strain continues to build, the question is no longer just about enduring the conditions, but about how long it is possible to keep responding to them before the system itself begins to give way. At the most severe point of winter, the Himalayas reveal a shift that is not immediately visible in the landscape, but becomes clear through the behavior of the animals. Because the greatest challenge is no longer just the cold or the snow, but the ability of the body itself to keep functioning under constant pressure. For the Barl, the accumulated strain of previous days begins to surface inevitably, not at a single moment, but as a sequence of small losses, movements that demand more effort than before, pauses that grow longer, and a resilience that no longer responds with the same efficiency, creating a scenario where every decision must consider not only external risks, but the internal cost of remaining active. The lack of food prevents any full recovery of energy, and what was once a temporary imbalance becomes a continuous state, where the body consumes more than it can restore, slowly moving toward a limit that cannot be avoided, only delayed. The thin air intensifies this process in silence, demanding more from the organism with every movement, turning even the simplest actions progressively more costly, until the effort required just to keep moving begins to approach its own limit of sustainability. The snow leopard responds to this phase differently, reducing unnecessary movement and focusing its energy on precise moments. Because each hunting attempt now carries greater weight, and failure is no longer just a possibility, but a loss that is difficult to recover from. Yet it remains part of the same system, bound by the same constraints, adjusting not to dominate the environment, but to remain within it. On a smaller scale, the pika depends entirely on the decisions made before winter, living within the limits of what it managed to store, with no margin for error and no possibility of replenishment. While the Himalayan fox continues to operate in an increasingly complex environment, where sound is distorted beneath the snow and every attempt requires more precision than the last, no strategy stops working entirely, but all of them begin to demand more than they once did. And it is at this point that the Himalayas make one of their harshest rules clear, because survival is no longer just about adapting or choosing well. It is about how long each organism can sustain its own function before the strain exceeds its limit, showing that in these mountains, the environment does not need to act directly. It only needs to keep applying pressure until the body can no longer respond. Even at the harshest point of winter, the Himalayas never stop changing, and those changes happen fast. Fast enough to erase any sense of stability as snowstorms redraw the landscape in a matter of hours, making trails disappear, shifting surfaces, and removing the landmarks that once guided movement, forcing every stretch of terrain to be interpreted again as if it were being crossed for the RST time. For the Barl, this transforms every step into a decision, because ground that once felt secure now conceals instability, increasing not only the risk of falling but also the possibility of the group losing cohesion. As distances begin to grow, awareness weakens, and reaction time narrows under constant pressure. The snow leopard does not resist these changes, it moves with them, taking advantage of sound absorbed by the snow and tracks that fade quickly, allowing the environment itself to become an ally, reducing detection and turning each approach into something quieter and more precise. In this moment, the prey no longer faces only a predator, but a landscape that actively works against it. Further down the slopes, the wild yak pushes through deep layers of snow, using its weight to reach buried vegetation, and in doing so, opens temporary access points that other species begin to use, reinforcing how even under extreme conditions the system remains connected. The Himalayan fox continues to hunt, but now in an environment that is increasingly difficult to interpret, where sound bends beneath the snow and direction becomes uncertain, forcing repeated attempts until precision replaces uncertainty, each failure carrying a cost that becomes harder to recover. The wind adds another layer of instability, shifting scent patterns, disrupting orientation, and interfering with the senses that animals rely on to survive. Nothing remains predictable long enough to be fully understood, and it is precisely this instability that begins to redefine the rules. Because survival is no longer only about enduring the cold or managing scarcity, it becomes the ability to respond to a world that changes faster than it can be read. And in the Himalayas, that leads to a single outcome. It is not only the animals facing the environment, it is the environment that ultimately decides who continues. After weeks under constant pressure, the Himalayas enter a phase where balance is no longer just fragile. It begins to break for part of the system, not as a sudden collapse, but as the result of accumulated strain that has been building over time. As the cold remains constant and scarcity continues to dictate the pace of survival, reducing any margin for error to almost nothing. Within the Bharl groups, this shift appears gradually, almost imperceptible at first, but becomes increasingly evident as some individuals begin to show clear signs of exhaustion, moving more slowly, pausing more often, and reacting just slightly later than the rest, creating differences that in this environment carry far greater consequences than they seem to at first glance. The group begins to lose its cohesion, distances between individuals expand, coordination weakens, and small moments of disorganization start to appear, and it is precisely within these subtle disruptions that the system begins to redefine itself. Snow leopard does not change its strategy, but now operates in a landscape where vulnerability emerges more frequently, allowing it to identify patterns with greater clarity, observing from a distance until a slight delay, a misplaced step, or a minor imbalance becomes the opportunity it has been waiting for. When that moment comes, the response remains fast, direct, and decisive, because under this level of pressure there is no space for prolonged reactions, and the outcome depends less on strength and more on timing and position. At the same time, less visible changes unfold across other layers of the ecosystem, particularly among smaller species, where some pikas that failed to build sufficient reserves simply disappear, reducing activity in areas that were once constant and creating gaps that may go unnoticed at first, but gradually alter the system as a whole. This reduction does not happen abruptly, but continuously, and over time begins to influence other species that depend on these interactions. While the Himalayan fox encounters slightly more opportunities, not through abundance, but through increasing vulnerability, making each hunting attempt more efficient. Above it all, the Himalayan vulture appears more frequently, following the outcomes of this process and reinforcing that, even in reduction, the cycle continues. What emerges at this stage is not a sudden collapse, but a silent reorganization, where the number of individuals begins to align with what the environment can sustain, removing excess and forcing the system into a new level of balance. And even at this critical point, life does not disappear. It adjusts, changes scale, and continues within increasingly narrow limits, until winter, still dominant, begins to show the first signs that its role is coming to an end, having selected and reduced what remains. By now, survival is no longer a chance, it is a selection. After everything that has happened, the Himalayas begin to change. But this shift does not bring relief. The ice starts to give way, the terrain transforms, and what seemed like the end of winter reveals an entirely new kind of challenge. This transition does not happen all at once, nor does it occur evenly. Because the cold still dominates the landscape, yet subtle variations in temperature begin to slowly reshape the environment. On sun-exposed slopes, ice melts briefly during the day, only to freeze again as temperatures drop, creating a continuous cycle that makes the ground even more unpredictable. It is no longer just about the depth of the snow, but about its consistency at any given moment, demanding a far more precise reading of the terrain. For the Barl, this introduces a different kind of difficulty. Areas that once provided stability now become slick and unreliable, increasing the danger across slopes that were already challenging by nature. At the same time, small patches of vegetation begin to reappear, exposed by the uneven thaw. Food returns, but in fragments, forcing the groups to move more frequently again, now across a landscape where every step requires even greater precision. The snow leopard follows this shift without changing its core behavior, but it adjusts its positioning as prey activity increases. More movement creates more opportunities, but also more risk. Because unstable terrain does not favor only those who flee, every attempt must now be calculated with greater care, where failure does not simply mean losing the chance to hunt, but risking injury. At slightly lower elevations, movement begins to expand. Yaks resume wider migrations, breaking through layers of snow and exposing vegetation beneath, creating access points that other species begin to use, reinforcing the interconnected nature of the system. Smaller animals, like the pika, start to reappear more frequently outside their shelters. The need to rebuild reserves becomes unavoidable, bringing back activity that had been reduced to a minimum during the harshest phase of winter. This return does not signal ease, it signals urgency. As movement increases on the ground, the sky responds in kind. The Himalayan vulture finds more signs to follow, reduces search time, and becomes more active within the cycle once again. And yet this phase is far from stable. The Himalayas enter a transitional state where the worst of winter has passed, but conditions remain unpredictable. Old strategies no longer work as they once did, and new ones are still being formed. What appears to be relief reveals a different kind of pressure, because now survival is no longer just about enduring, but about adapting quickly to a world that changes day by day. As the days gradually grow longer, the Himalayas begin to emerge from their most restrictive state, but this transition does not happen suddenly. It unfolds slowly, as small changes accumulate and begin to reshape the behavior of the entire ecosystem, allowing what was once a strict economy of energy to give way to a gradual return of movement. The Barls start to move more frequently, exploring areas where the snow has receded enough to expose patches of vegetation, still limited and uneven, yet already representing a meaningful shift from the previous phase, allowing the group to regain part of the cohesion that had been lost during the harshest period of winter. This return to movement, however, does not eliminate risk, because the terrain remains unstable in many areas, especially where melting and refreezing create unpredictable surfaces, forcing constant attention and reinforcing the need to interpret the environment with precision at every step. The snow leopard follows this change without altering its core behavior, adjusting its presence as prey activity increases, since more movement expands the chances of encounter, while also demanding greater accuracy in every attempt, as the terrain continues to impose risks on both hunter and prey. At the same time, smaller animals like the pika begin to appear more frequently outside their shelters, driven by the need to rebuild reserves and restore a cycle that had been interrupted, reactivating an essential layer of the ecosystem. This renewed activity also affects smaller predators, such as the Himalayan fox, which finds new opportunities and adjusts its strategy accordingly, combining active exploration with the use of newly exposed areas. In lower regions, yaks expand their movements, opening pathways and facilitating access to resources, indirectly connecting different parts of the landscape and reinforcing that even after a phase of extreme reduction, the system remains deeply interconnected. Above it all, the Himalayan vulture resumes a more active pattern, following the increase in activity on the ground and locating opportunities with greater efficiency. And yet, there is a crucial detail in this stage, because the return of movement does not mean safety. It introduces new layers of risk that had been temporarily reduced. As increased activity leads to more encounters, more competition, and more opportunities for mistakes, making it clear that surviving winter does not represent stability, but only the transition into a new phase where challenges continue, just in a different form. As the transition continues, the Himalayas begin to show a more active surface, but this change does not represent a return to what once existed, because what emerges now is a new balance, shaped directly by everything that was lost during the winter. The Barl that managed to endure begin to spread across wider areas as vegetation slowly returns, and group behavior regains strength. not only as a form of protection, but as an efficient way to navigate a landscape that still demands caution, since the terrain continues to present variations capable of turning any movement into risk. This renewed activity carries the memory of what came before, influencing every decision, every step, and every pause, because recent experience reshapes how the environment is read. The snow leopard remains part of this system, now facing prey that are more dispersed, and a territory that demands greater coverage, forcing it to adjust its movement without abandoning the principle that defines its survival, the balance between effort and outcome. At the same time, smaller organisms like the pika become more visible again, rebuilding their reserves and reorganizing their shelters. While the Himalayan fox follows this increase in activity, exploring new opportunities in a landscape that offers more possibilities, but still demands precision. In areas where the snow has receded more significantly, yaks expand their presence and continue to shape the terrain indirectly, opening access points that influence other species and reinforce the connections within the ecosystem. Above all of this, the Himalayan vulture maintains its essential role, following the flow of the system and ensuring that every stage of the cycle continues to move forward. What emerges at this point is not a recovered environment. It is an adjusted one, a system that continues to function within the limits imposed by altitude, climate, and time, where every change redefines the space available for life. And that makes one thing clear. In the Himalayas, balance is never fixed, because here, it is never given, it is earned. After moving through all these phases, the Himalayas no longer feel like just an extreme environment. They begin to reveal a far more precise pattern, where nothing happens by chance in every behavior. Every adaptation and every decision is shaped directly by altitude, cold, and scarcity. There is no excess and no comfortable margin, only constant adjustment within clearly defined limits, where life does not attempt to change the environment or make it easier, but instead finds ways to exist within those constraints. The snow leopard does not dominate through strength, but through precision. The bharal do not depend on speed, but on constant awareness of the terrain, and the pika does not confront winter when it arrives. It prepares long before it begins. When these strategies come together, the result is not perfection, but function, a system that continues because every element operates within its limits. In regions where human presence is still possible, communities like the Sherpas follow this same logic, shaping their lives around the rhythm of the mountains, raising yaks, respecting natural cycles, and maintaining a relationship that does not seek to control the environment, but to live alongside it. Making one thing clear, survival here has never been about dominance. It has always been about understanding, and perhaps that is what truly defines this place. Because in the Himalayas, the challenge never disappears. It only changes form. The cold returns, scarcity remains, and the terrain continues to shift. And even so, life finds a way to continue, to reorganize, and to begin again. And if you want to keep exploring how life survives in the most extreme environments on Earth, you can subscribe to the channel, because there is still much more to discover. Because in the Himalayas, even breathing remains a challenge, and yet, life goes on.